Welcome to a deep dive into a really critical and maybe slightly terrifying area of cybersecurity. We're looking at source material covering how attackers have been getting past our endpoint security tools. Things like EDR and antivirus over the past 5 years or so.
That's right. The mission here is really to unpack this complex topic. Understand the clever and sometimes, frankly, shockingly simple ways adversaries are bypassing defenses. And figure out what you need to know to stay informed and, well, better protected. We've got a stack of research reports, case studies, detailing attacks from, say, 2020 right up to early 2025.
So yeah, forget just knowing what EDR is. We're going to explore how attackers are turning these tools, and sometimes even the operating system itself, against the defender. It's a real cat and mouse game, isn't it? Understanding these techniques is just crucial. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the big trend, looking over 2020, 2025, isn't just making malware harder to spot, like through obfuscation. Attackers are really focusing now on neutralizing the security software itself once they get onto an endpoint.
So if they can disable the guard, the malware can just run freely. That makes sense, but is this like a common thing now?
Exactly. And yes, very common. The source notes this has become a primary tactic for major ransomware gangs. Think Babuk, LockBit, BlackByte, AvosLocker, and also APTs like ToddyCat. We've seen it in really high-profile cases. It just underscores that running an EDR agent isn't some kind of magic bullet if the attacker can just turn it off or, blind it.
Okay, right. Here's where it gets really interesting. How are they actually doing this? The sources seem to break it down into a few key areas, a few techniques.
Yeah, they do. First up is something called BYOI, Bring Your Own Installer. Now, this technique sounds kind of counterintuitive because it involves using the security product's own legitimate installer or updater against itself.
Wait, hang on. They use the tool meant to protect you.
Yeah.
To disable it.
Yes.
That's audacious. How does that even work?
Well, modern EDRs have pretty robust tamper protection, right? Makes them hard to just kill or uninstall without permission. However, during a legitimate upgrade, or maybe a reinstall process, the EDR agent has to intentionally stop itself to perform the update. So attackers, assuming they've already got administrator access on the endpoint, they realize they could kick off this legitimate process, but then interrupt it at just the right moment.
So they exploit that tiny window where the agent is shutting down. Can you walk us through the technical mechanics?
Sure. So the attacker runs the official EDR installer. Maybe it's an MSI file or some setup executable. The installer's first step, typically, is to shut down the EDR agent that's currently running. And its service. It's getting ready for the upgrade.
Right.
So at that point, the endpoint is temporarily unprotected. The attacker then just forcibly terminates the installer process itself, like killing mzxx.exe or whatever it is, before the new agent actually finishes installing and starts up again.
And the result is?
The old agent is gone, or it's inactive, and the new one never got a chance to start. So the endpoint is left effectively blind. Or it might just show up as offline in the EDR console. It's basically a race condition, exploiting the EDR's own update logic. It does need admin privileges, that's key. But it doesn't need some fancy vulnerability in the agent code itself, just understanding how the update works.
That's, wow, brilliant in a terrifying way. Did we actually see this used in real attacks?
Oh, absolutely. The source material highlights a really notable case from January 2025. Affiliates of the Babuk ransomware group that compromised the server, got admin rights, and then used the legitimate Sentinel and Windows installer, ran it, then killed the installation process halfway through.
And it worked.
It worked, left the endpoint wide open. They deployed Babuk ransomware successfully, no EDR interference. And the critical point here, again, no third-party toolkits, no 0 days. They just used the vendor's own file.
How does Sentinel respond to that?
Well, they quickly advise customers to enable a specific feature. It's called online local authorization for agent upgrades. This setting, which, isn't always on by default, requires approval from the cloud console for any local install or uninstall attempts. And once that was enabled, apparently the bypass failed. They also released a detection rule, potential BYOI exploitation, to try and flag this kind of attempt.
Okay, so the key insight here is attackers are forcing us to think not just about what our EDR does, but how its basic processes like updates or uninstalls actually work. They basically turn system maintenance into an attack surface you have to secure.
Exactly. It points to a broader kind of weakness where installation logic needs stronger checks. It shouldn't be that easy for an admin to just, reinstall something to disable it, even if they are admin.
Okay, that BYOI thing is wild. Using the installer itself, what's the next major technique the sources cover?
Right. Next up is BYOVD. That's bring your own vulnerable driver. Now, this one is particularly potent because it operates at the highest privilege level in Windows, the kernel. Attackers are using legitimate, digitally signed drivers that have known vulnerabilities, to gain kernel access.
So hold on. They use a driver that Windows trusts because it's signed, but it has a flaw they can exploit to attack the security software.
Precisely. They drop a vulnerable driver file, usually a sys file from some older but legitimate piece of software, onto the system and load it. Once this driver is running with kernel privileges because, Windows trusts its signature, they exploit its known flaw. Maybe it allows arbitrary kernel memory writes or lets them terminate protected processes. They use that flaw to kill security processes, maybe remove EDR callbacks, or even unload security drivers entirely. It effectively turns the OS's trust mechanism against the security tools.
That sounds much harder to defend against than just stopping a service.
It is, yeah, because it operates below the user mode where most EDR agents actually live. Once they're in the kernel, they can often bypass user mode protections like the agent self-defense mechanisms or things like process protection light, PPL. And this technique has become, almost a standard tactic for many ransomware as a service groups and APTs.
Are there any real-world cases that stand out?
Oh, plenty. Sources list quite a few. Back in 2022, the BlackByte ransomware gang, they exploited a vulnerable driver from MSI Afterburner. It's called rtcore64.sys. Had a known CVE. They used it to disable EDR by messing with kernel interfaces. Around the same time, AvosLocker ransomware was seen abusing a legitimate but old Avast anti-rootkit driver as rpot.sys to terminate security processes.
Okay.
Then by 2023, we started seeing dedicated EDR killer tools emerge. There's one called AWKILL, which was used with Medusa Locker and even LockBit. It uses an outdated Process Explorer driver, preocexp.sys. The source actually notes this is quite similar to an open source tool called Backstab from 2021. Shows how these proofs of concept get weaponized pretty quickly. And then a really major campaign in 2024 involved the RansomHub gang. They had a custom tool called EDR Kill Shifter. Checkpoint research found something like over 2,500 variants of a vulnerable TrueSight anti-rootkit driver being used. They cleverly modified the driver files just slightly to evade hash detection. And they exploited this loophole where drivers signed before July 2015 weren't automatically blacklisted by Microsoft. ESET and Halcyon Research showed this EDR kill shifter was offered through RansomHub's affiliate program, and then it sort of spilled over to Play, BNLian, and other Medusa gangs too.
Wow. EDR kill shifter being shared across multiple groups? It really highlights how effective it must have been. So the core insight here is attackers are weaponizing legacy trust, leveraging the fact that Windows trusts signed drivers, even old vulnerable ones, to get kernel access and bypass user mode security.
Exactly that. The source explicitly says it could disable an enormous range of EDR tools. And the critical point is, BYOVD attacks, they generally target whatever EDR or AV is present. They just try to terminate processes by name or attack kernel structures. So really, no single vendor is inherently safe from this technique if the specific vulnerable driver being used isn't blocked somehow.
What can defenders actually do against BYOVD then?
Well, mitigations include things like Microsoft's vulnerable driver block list. They do update it like they did in December 2024 for those TrueSight variants. Some EDRs, like ESET, for example, have features to detect loading of drivers from unusual locations or known vulnerable ones. But fundamentally, implementing least privilege, making it hard for attackers to install any drivers in the first place, is key. And also making sure legitimate software drivers on your systems, especially older ones from gaming tools or utilities, are actually up to date.
Okay, so they're using installers, they're using drivers. What else have attackers been up to?
Right. The next category is DLL hijacking and side-loading. This technique also subverts trust, but in a different way. It makes legitimate, often signed applications load malicious code under their own trusted process. Attackers exploit how Windows searches for dynamic link libraries, DLLs, or they misuse signed binaries, sometimes called living off the land binaries or LOL bins.
How does that work, technically speaking?
Well, applications need to load DLLs to function right. Windows searches for these DLLs in a specific order of directories. Now, if an application is coded, let's say insecurely, or if it looks in its current directory before the system paths, an attacker can place a malicious DLL with the expected name in that location. When the legitimate application runs, it accidentally loads the malicious DLL instead of the real one.
Okay. And the other method?
The other method uses a signed executable, a LOL bin, that's known to load a particular DLL. The attacker places their malicious version of that expected DLL in a location where the signed exe will find it first, maybe the same directory. So the malicious code then runs inside the trusted signed process, often inheriting its privileges or just bypassing security checks because the host process itself is considered legitimate.
This sounds like another clever way to blend in. Were there cases where this directly targeted security tools themselves?
Yes, definitely. A notable one came up in 2024. It involved the ToddyCat APT group and ESET's command line scanner, ekls.exe. ToddyCat found that ESET's scanner insecurely tried to load a standard Windows DLL, version.dll, from its current working directory. So the attackers just dropped a malicious version.dll right there. When ekls.exe was run, it loaded the malicious one instead. And that malicious DLL, running with ESET's trust and privileges, then modified kernel structures to disable security notifications, basically creating a blind spot. This was serious enough it got its own CVE number, CVE 2024-11959, and ESET patched it in January 2025. Another case, going back to 2022, involved a LockBit affiliate. They abused Microsoft Defender's command line tool, mpcmdrun.exe. They paired the legitimate mpcmdrun.exe with a fake malicious mpclient.dll. When mpcmdrun.exe was executed, it loaded the attacker's DLL, which then injected a Cobalt Strike beacon. So they used a Microsoft-signed binary as a loader to evade detection, running attacker code within a process the system implicitly trusts.
So the insight here is attackers exploiting trust relationships within the OS itself, making legitimate applications their unwitting accomplices to bypass security checks.
Exactly. And while it's not always about directly disabling the EDR, running your malicious code inside a trusted process, well, it often bypasses the kind of scrutiny and monitoring that would normally catch malware behavior, so it's effectively bypassing detection. Other ransomware groups have used DLL side-loading with things like VMware utilities or sysinternals tools, mostly for stealth.
What's the defense against DLL hijacking then?
Well, vendors need to fix insecure loading paths in their applications, like ESET did with their patch. That's step one. For defenders, you can use things like Microsoft's attack surface reduction, ASR rules. Some of those rules can block suspicious behaviors, like a trusted application suddenly launching unexpected child processes. And monitoring EDR telemetry is key here too. Look for trusted processes loading unusual DLLs or maybe running from abnormal paths, like mpcmdrun.exe shouldn't really be executing from a temp directory, right? That's a red flag.
Got it. So we've covered installers, drivers, DLLs. What's the last major way attackers are trying to get past endpoint defenses, according to the sources?
Right. The final category is a bit broader. It includes manipulating OS features or sometimes the security software's own service controls. Some of these are actually older tricks that seem to have reemerged, probably because they still work if defenses aren't configured quite right.
Like just turning it off. I thought tamper protection was supposed to stop that.
Ideally, yes, it should. But attackers are always probing for weaknesses, looking for misconfigurations, or sometimes abusing diagnostic features that might operate outside normal protections.
Can you give some examples of these methods?
Sure. One big one is safe mode abuse. Many security agents, maybe most, don't actually run in Windows safe mode. It's designed as a minimal diagnostic environment. So ransomware groups like Snash way back in 2019-2020, and more recently AvosLocker in 2023, they figured out how to force reboot infected machines into safe mode. And then they encrypt the data while all of the defenses are inactive. It completely bypasses the agent's self-defense.
Oh, okay.
Then there's abusing OS tools. If attackers get admin access, they'll definitely try using built-in commands like sc.exe or netstop to disable security services. Or they might try modifying registry keys, like disabling Defender's real-time monitoring via a PowerShell command, like set in preference. Now, success here really depends heavily on the security product's tamper protection being properly enabled and enforced. But attackers still try it, hoping to find systems where it's weak or maybe turned off.
Makes sense. Any others?
Yeah, sometimes the security agents themselves have vulnerabilities. Not necessarily code execution flaws, but maybe logic flaws that allow disruption. The source mentions a 2023 case involving CrowdStrike Falcon. Apparently, a logic flaw allowed attackers, if they had sufficient privileges, to suspend its processes. CrowdStrike patched it quickly, of course, but it just shows that even top-tier EDRs can have these edge cases that attackers might find and exploit.
Right.
And finally, there's just general living off the land with OS features, things like abusing system repair or recovery environments, or using tools like msconfig to force a minimal boot state, which BlackByte was seen doing in 2022. Even running malware inside a virtual machine on the host system, RansomLocker famously did this back in 2020, can sometimes evade host-based EDR by isolating the malicious activity from the host OS.
These seem maybe simpler than the driver attacks, but clearly still effective if they work. So the key takeaway here is attackers are constantly testing the boundaries of tamper protection, and they're leveraging OS-level features that might not be fully monitored or secured by default.
Pretty much, they can be effective. While often noisy, reboots or server stop commands might get logged if they succeed, they lead to a complete bypass. Those safe mode attacks were particularly nasty because the endpoint would just vanish from the EDR console. Defenders would only find out later that encryption happened while the agent was effectively offline. The source really emphasizes, if anti-tampering is weak or disabled, admin-level malware will exploit that to turn off the security product. It's a prime target.
What are the defenses against this kind of service abuse or OS feature manipulation?
Well, number one is enabling and enforcing tamper protection everywhere. Absolutely paramount. Microsoft Defender has it. Other EDRs have similar features. Make sure it's on and requires authorization to disable. This prevents those unauthorized attempts to stop services or mess with settings. Where possible, look for features that might offer protection even in safe mode, although that's less common. Setting BIOS passwords can help prevent unauthorized boot changes. And again, limiting local administrator accounts is fundamental. It just raises the bar significantly. Crucially, though, monitoring for security services stopping or agents going offline unexpectedly is key. You have to treat any unexpected agent status change, disabled, offline, whatever, as a potential incident and investigate immediately. Don't just assume it's a glitch. Also, watch for system reboots into safe mode in your event logs. That's a big indicator.
Okay, so we've looked at four main categories of evasion techniques over the past 5 years: installers, drivers, DLLs, and service OS abuse. When did these really become prominent, and I guess have all vendors been affected equally?
Looking at the timeline from the source material, yeah, you can see an evolution. Safe mode abuse popped up early, gained attention with snatch ransomware back in late 2019, early 2020. BYOVD, the driver technique, kind of emerged with open source tools like Backstab around 2021, but it really became widespread with ransomware groups like BlackByte and Awkill through 2022, 2023. And then it hit a peak with those scaled RansomHub campaigns using EDR Killshifter in 2024. DLL Side-Loading got public attention, maybe most notably with LockBit abusing Defender in 2022, and then that very targeted ToddyCat attack on ESET in late 2024. And BYOI, the installer abuse, while it might have been happening under the radar, really got significant public focus with that Babuk Sentinel case in early 2025.
Yeah.
What's really fascinating, though, is how quickly these techniques spread. They get adopted across different threat actor groups once proven effective, and critically, the source's summary table makes it pretty clear. No single vendor is immune. Techniques like BYOVD or safe mode abuse, they can potentially impact any EDR or AV if the right mitigations aren't in place, or if the specific vulnerable driver isn't blocked. DLL side-loading often exploits OS behavior or specific trusted binaries, so it affects vendors if their application has a loading vulnerability or if they don't detect the resulting malicious behavior effectively. And even agent-specific vulnerabilities or logic flaws, like that CrowdStrike Falcon example, they show that constant vigilance and patching are needed across the board. It's definitely a shared challenge for the entire industry, not just a problem for one or two vendors.
Right. Given all this evolution in attacker techniques, what does this really mean for someone on the ground trying to defend their network? What are the key takeaways for defenders here?
Yeah, the source provides some really strong strategic recommendations based on all these observed attacks. It really boils down to building a multi-layered, resilient defense posture, not relying on just one thing.
Okay, what are some of those recommendations?
Well, first and foremost, 1. Enable and enforce anti-tamper. Seriously, this is non-negotiable. Require authorization, preferably from the central console, for any uninstalls or upgrades. Verify that tamper protection is actually on everywhere for Microsoft Defender and your chosen EDR. This is your first line against attackers just turning off protection. 2. Adopt driver load controls. Use Microsoft's vulnerable driver block list. Enable features like hypervisor protected code integrity, HVCI, if your hardware supports it. Consider EDR or OS controls that can block any kernel drivers that aren't explicitly approved or signed correctly. And again, limit who can install drivers. 3. Harden your endpoint agent configurations. Don't just use default settings, use the most secure options your EDR offers. This includes enabling things like online or cloud authorization for local updates, like that Sentinel feature. Use the highest protection modes available. Password protect any recovery or safe boot options if the agent has them. 4. Stay current with patches for both EDR and OS. Apply vendor patches for your endpoint security software promptly. Vendors fix these vulnerabilities and logic flaws that attackers exploit. Just as importantly, keep the underlying operating system updated as Microsoft pushes out driver blocklist updates and other security fixes. 5. Limit administrator privileges. Least privilege. It's fundamental, always has been. Reduce the number of users with local admin rights, especially on workstations. This dramatically limits an attacker's ability to perform many of these evasion techniques, like installing drivers or stopping services, even if they manage to get malware onto a machine initially.
Okay, those make sense. Anything else?
Yes, a few more operational points. 6. Monitor for evasion indicators. You need specific alerts for this stuff. Look for mass process termination events, especially targeting security processes. Monitor for unusual child processes spawning from security tools or trusted OS binaries. Alert on unexpected driver installations. And, as I mentioned critically, treat any EDR agent going offline or reporting a disabled state as a high-priority incident. Investigate immediately. 7. Improve resilience and response. Plan for the fact that your EDR agent might get bypassed or go offline. Have endpoint isolation capabilities ready, maybe network control so you can contain a potentially compromised host quickly. Ensure you have well-tested backup and restoration plans. Assume a lost agent could mean an active attack is underway and have response playbooks ready for that scenario. 8. Leverage behavioral analytics. Use EDR or MDR solutions that focus on behavioral analytics. These systems can sometimes spot the outcomes or side effects of evasion attempts, like weird system reboots into safe mode, or unusual sequences of tool usage, even if the direct telemetry from the agent itself was temporarily blinded or disabled.
So it really comes down to, it's not just about having the EDR tool installed. It's much more about how you configure it, how you monitor it, and how you layer it with other defenses and solid operational practices.
Exactly. That's the core message. Knowing these techniques exist is step 1. But step 2 is actively implementing the safeguards, using the advanced configuration options your security tools provide, and then vigilantly monitoring for the signs, sometimes subtle, sometimes obvious, that attackers are trying to use these methods against you.
Wow. That was a really, really deep dive into how the bad guys have been stepping up their game against endpoint security over these past few years. It's absolutely clear the arms race is constantly evolving. Attackers are finding incredibly creative ways to bypass defenses, often by leveraging our own systems and even our own security tools against us.
It absolutely reinforces the point that relying on a single layer of security or just sticking with default configurations, it's just not enough anymore. The sophistication involved in using things like legitimate installers or trusted but vulnerable drivers, it shows they're really probing every angle to undermine our defenses, often from the inside out.
Absolutely fascinating and genuinely quite eye-opening. This deep dive really underscores the importance of vigilant configuration, proactive monitoring, and really understanding the specific ways attackers were operating right now.
Indeed, it's crucial.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, to perhaps mull over? Maybe the most important question is this. If attackers can successfully use trusted parts of your own system installers, drivers, even core operating system functions to disable your security, how deeply do you really need to understand the internal workings and the default behaviors of your own environment, not just focusing on the threats coming from the outside? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.